I'm Nima Rajan. Prime Minister Justin Trudeau is kicking off 2 days of talks at the United Nations Climate Summit in Glasgow. He joins over 120 other world leaders. The COP26 Climate Convention will mark Canada's first steps toward capping emissions from the oil and gas sector. Canada's largest target is to have 40 to 45% fewer emissions than in 2005 by 2030. Deputy Prime Minister Chrystia Freeland says Canada will donate 10 million doses of Moderna's COVID-19 vaccine to the COVAX vaccine sharing facility.
The announcement that 10 million doses from Moderna that we have ordered will go straight from Moderna to COVAX is significant.
She says Canada will donate 200 million vaccine doses by the end of next year. Vaccine equity was a hot issue on the table at the G20 summit in Rome, and there were warnings from the IMF and the WHO, among others, that inequitable distribution of vaccines will postpone the global economic recovery. Well, Novavax has submitted its COVID-19 vaccine for approval by Health Canada. The U.S. biotechnology company's submission includes clinical data from a trial of 30,000 participants in the U.S. and Mexico. It says the trial found 100% protection against moderate and severe disease and over 90% efficacy overall. A new study is making the case for active screening for tuberculosis. This especially among Inuit communities where the rate of the infection is much higher than in the rest of Canada. The study was conducted by McGill University researchers. It estimates that one round of active screening among Inuit populations reduced tuberculosis disease by 13% in 2019. It suggests biennial screening would decrease incidence rates by 59%. A tale of two boards made it to the BC Supreme Court today. The battle for control of Rogers Communications has publicly pitted members of the Rogers family against one another. A petition filed by Edward Rogers last week asks the court to legitimize a board he formed after being ousted as chair last month. His mother, sisters, and their associates say the only valid board is the one that existed prior to Mr. Edwards' changes. University researchers and drug developers in Edmonton are joining forces to seek a solution to Canada's inability to create its own drug supply. Advanced Pharmaceutical Innovation is a nonprofit which employs about 40 scientists at its Edmonton facility. It is teaming up with the University of Alberta's renowned Lee Ka-shing Institute of Virology to form the Canadian Critical Drug Initiative. Heather Stephenson will soon be sworn in and become Manitoba's first ever female premier. Ms. Stephenson scored a narrow victory over rival Shelley Glover on the weekend for the leadership of the governing Progressive Conservatives. However, Ms. Shelley Glover is challenging the result. She is calling for Heather Stephenson's swearing in to be delayed, this in order to contest the result in court. Starting today, Quebec bars and restaurants can operate at full capacity and resume normal hours. This comes more than a year after limits were imposed to curb the spread of COVID-19. Establishments that serve alcohol will now be allowed to stay open until 3 a.m. And the distance between tables will drop from 2 meters to 1 meter. Quebecers are still required to present their vaccine passport before entering and wear masks when moving around indoors. The ban on dancing and singing remains in effect until further notice. The leader of the official opposition in New Brunswick says Premier Blaine Higgs should be locked in a negotiating room with striking CUPE workers, not locking them out. Roger Melanson says the government is trying to punish the employees rather than trying to settle on adequate wages and benefits. Schools across the province moved to online learning today. This after the government locked out non-designated school employees in 2 CUPE locals due to the strike. A vaccination clinic and some COVID-19 screening were also cancelled over the weekend. The Royal Canadian Legion's Poppy campaign is bringing back payments from tap-enabled devices or cards. This as well as digital poppies that can be purchased online and shared on social media. That's in addition to the more than 34,000 traditional poppy boxes across the country. The Poppy campaign's mission is to raise money to support veterans and veteran assistance programs. Well, meanwhile, the mother of a soldier killed in Afghanistan 12 years ago has been named this year's Silver Cross Mother by the Royal Canadian Legion. Josie Simard from Quebec will lay a wreath at the National War Memorial on Remembrance Day. She says the loss of her daughter, Army Corporal Karen Blay, shattered the family, but that her spirit lives on in their memories. 21-year-old Corporal Blay was less than 2 weeks into her first tour of duty in Afghanistan when her armored vehicle was hit by a roadside bomb. All right, we'll be right back. Stay tuned. The final communique from the two-day G20 summit is vague about the deadline for countries to reach net zero carbon emissions. The Prime Minister says he hoped for a stronger and more ambitious agreement on climate change, but Justin Trudeau said leaders still managed to make what he calls significant progress by recognizing that countries need to aim to keep global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius. The PM says there's also progress in at least recognizing that phasing out the use of coal and methane is critical to the fight against climate change. Well, to tell us more about the G20 and what it may mean for Canadians is the Honourable Stockwell Day, consultant and former international trade minister. Sir, welcome back to Forum Daily.
Great to be with you, Nima.
Now, the Prime Minister has said that he hoped for a more ambitious agreement, but he at the same time added that we made significant progress. So can you provide some more specifics regarding this?
Sure. He's obviously, he's putting a good face on it and trying to be optimistic. He and some of the other leaders had hoped for something more definitive. But as is emerging now, there were other countries who were saying, no, these timelines are too tight. So it might sound ambitious, but I guess you'd call it aspirational. They said, we can't legislate 1.5 degrees, an increase of heat in the planet till the end of the century. So how about we say we like the idea? And how about if we can't get a date on coal emission to net zero, how about we say we like the idea of proceeding towards that? Same with the percentage of electric vehicles. So they've changed it from definitive to aspirational.
And what kind of impact do you think this change from definitive to aspirational will have on the overall fight against climate change, sir?
That's a key approach that you've just mentioned there, because there are countries that are saying this is too aggressive. There are countries that are saying, yes, we agree that we need to reduce emissions, but they're not necessarily agreed that this is what you would call a full-blown crisis. And they're concerned about their economies if they shut off all traditional approaches to energy. So in a way, it's kind of a hybrid, if we can use that word, deal to try and satisfy both sides of that equation.
And considering we had the G20 environment ministers meeting earlier this year, they arrived at an impasse at phasing out coal as well. So was this final agreement from the G20 meeting expected?
Many people would not realize that when you go into agreements like this, and I've been involved in many over the years where they're international and you're hoping to get a signing, actually, the agreement is largely settled before the leaders ever get there. You have your own officials working with officials from other countries weeks and even months ahead. So no leader is going in there with a surprise, and they will send out what they think of the wording of a communication piece even before they get there. At the last minute, you're rarely going to see a change. So this was more or less agreed on. They get together, and then they think by seeing each other personally, they can maybe hold one another's feet to the fire. But that communique would have largely been settled even before this started.
All right, sir, just about 2 minutes left here. But another big aspect of the G20 summit was an agreement around international tax. So can you unpack the impact of this for our viewers?
This is actually very significant. The fact that you've got this many countries, and I think they've probably got over 100 countries signed on to tax agreements. And there's dispute and debate on both sides of this issue, Nima, because a lot of countries and some people, I'll include myself in that, think that taxation levels should always be a matter of national autonomy, a matter of your own country's final decisions. Sure, you're going to work on tax agreements with other countries, but to agree on a level of taxation and hold to it, it's quite formidable. And the debate rages from it keeps countries from setting up, or businesses from setting up shop with prohibitively low rates. But it also takes away some of the autonomy that comes with a country setting its own rates. Ireland, for instance, over the last few decades has been able to attract business because of very competitive tax rates. So this is a very significant move. Countries, in a way, are signing away their autonomy when it comes to some of their federal tax levels.
All right, so just about a minute left here, but let's jump from G20 to the COP26 summit occurring right now. What kind of impact do you think the G20 will have on the climate conference so far?
It is going to have some impact. Already some are saying they're using maybe a Halloween reference, but, talking about the fact that the G20 was really what you might call a dress rehearsal for Glasgow, and people starting to stake out their positions. So there should be no surprises as people arrive now. They've already stated what they want. So it is going to have some effect, I think a significant effect. It'll take the pressure off of those who didn't want to actually be signing deals that would make a difference or possibly hurt them. It also gives them some room to move when you consider the fact that China is not involved at all. Russia is not involved at all. Mm-hmm. So you've got a huge producer and a huge emitter not even showing up. So it's going to set the stage for some tough discussions.
Ontario long-term care providers that violated regulations during the pandemic won't be fined retroactively under new legislation introduced last week. No fines have been issued so far by the Ministry of Long-Term Care since COVID-19 hit. The current government says that's because the previous government didn't enact a law allowing the ministry to issue the fines. A spokeswoman for Long-Term Care Minister Ron Phillips says new, tougher fines of up to $1 million for corporations can be applied after the new law is enacted. But she says those fines won't be issued retroactively. Well, joining us now to talk more on Ontario's new long-term care legislation and how that compares to the rest of Canada is Miss Jody Hall, the CEO of the Canadian Association for Long-Term Care. Ms. Hall, welcome to Forum Daily.
Thank you.
All right, so let's start with a brief picture of how the long-term care sector was impacted during the pandemic.
Well, I think it's understood by most in the Canadian public that long-term care homes and our residents were disproportionately affected by COVID in a very tragic way. Really, COVID served as almost a catalyst to many of the long-standing systemic challenges that we've had across the country related to chronic underfunding, issues with short staffing, supply, and certainly aged infrastructure played a role in that as well.
All right, and what do we know so far about Ontario's newly proposed long-term care legislation, ma'am?
Well, we know that it's looking to strengthen accountability and certainly create a greater focus on the resident and their quality of life and quality of care. But I think it's important to note that it's only gone through first reading and there are still many steps ahead. So it certainly is reasonable to anticipate there could be further changes at this stage.
And we're hearing from critics saying that this legislation doesn't go far enough to address the issues and gaps in Ontario's long-term care sector. What are your thoughts on this?
Well, I think that we're very pleased to see that it's legislation that lays a foundation for the modernization of long-term care in that province and helps to support a stable long-term care environment that can give confidence to residents and their families, as well as to the general public, that long-term care is meeting the expectations that we all collectively have. It's important that all governments and territories do their own kind of needs assessment and sort of breakdown of what did occur during the pandemic to come up with the right solutions for the homes in those provinces. And it's very critically important that they work with the long-term care homes themselves and families and residents to come up with those correct solutions.
All right, ma'am. Now, a lot of criticism is around the aspect of fines in this legislation, of them not being issued retroactively. So what are the pros and cons of this move here?
Well, I mean, I think that it would be very difficult to have a law have force and effect for events that occurred before it existed. So from that very perspective, I think that that's a real challenge. But I think what we can say about the last 20 months is that, it's really been unprecedented, the impact that the pandemic has had on long-term care. And, the frontline staff and the leaders in long-term care really have done extraordinary work. So as we look forward to the future, we really need to be looking at an approach that brings those resources and stable funding that is sustainable to these homes so that they are being supported in the proper way. And, it's really important to also note that, there's a tremendous amount of work that's also happening with the federal government with the development of national long-term care standards. So, bringing all of these groups together, both levels of government and the long-term care sector itself for sort of a Team Canada approach really is foundational to how we can make changes.
All right, ma'am, just about a minute left here, but what other initiatives would you like to see in improving long-term care, not only in Ontario, but the rest of Canada?
Creating a national strategy for health human resources to me is an absolute necessity. Finding a way that we can address immigration policy that helps to prioritize those who come from a healthcare background and willing to work in long-term care in Canada. Domestic workforce development, working with colleges and universities is also critically important, that we're creating our own opportunities with Canadians. And, shoring up mental health support so that we're building resiliency and supporting the existing workforce that we have so that they stay engaged. Infrastructure, creating opportunities to access financing, and that dedicated, sustainable funding is absolutely necessary for the future.
We'll be right back. The head of the United Nations has warned leaders at the Global Climate Summit in Glasgow that we are digging our own graves by burning fossil fuels and destroying the environment. UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres gave a shout-out to countries like Canada and Germany for pledging to reduce emissions. But he says the world is still heading for disaster. Secretary General Guterres is urging major economic powers to, quote, go the extra mile because they contribute the lion's share of global GHG emissions. Meanwhile, a call from environmental activists to the charitable world and other sectors has been simple. Ditch fossil fuels and direct your investments into climate-friendly companies and funds. Now, two of the biggest American names in philanthropy, the Ford and the MacArthur Foundations, say they are reorienting their investments away from fossil fuels. One leader in the divestment movement, Ellen Dorsey, believes it may be a tipping point for the movement within the philanthropic community. With inflation at its highest point in 3 decades, the Federal Reserve is set to begin winding down its extraordinary pandemic support this week. The process could prove to be a risky balancing act. Chair Jerome Powell has signaled that after the Fed's policy meeting on Wednesday, it will start cutting down its $120 billion monthly bond purchases as early as this month. More than 5 million people around the world have now died of COVID-19. Experts say that number is likely an underestimation. The crisis has impacted wealthy and poor countries alike. Together, the U.S., the European Union, Britain, and Brazil account for 1/8 of the world's population, but nearly half of all reported deaths. Russian President Vladimir Putin has emphasized the need to strengthen the country's air defenses. This comes amid NATO's military activities near Russia's borders. Mr. Putin specifically noted the deployment of NATO's U.S.-led missile defense components in Eastern Europe and the increasingly frequent missions by NATO ships near Russian waters in the Baltic and Black Seas. Philippines forces have killed a key communist rebel commander in one of Asia's longest-running insurgencies. The military described the action as a raid, while rebel leaders say it was an ambush. Jorge Madlos, who used the false name Ka Oris, was for many decades a leading figure and spokesman for the communist fighters in the southern Philippines. Tribal protesters have lifted their weeks-long blockade on Sudan's main seaport and oil pipelines, and they have reopened roads linking the port to the rest of the country. An official of the Baja Tribal Council says they have reached a deal with the military. It was to lift the blockade on the Red Sea port in Port Sudan for 1 month. This is to allow for the formation of a new government. The development comes a week after the military dissolved the transitional government in a coup. Ethiopia's prime minister has called on citizens to redouble their efforts to combat the rival Tigray forces. The forces claim to have seized their key cities on a major highway leading to the capital. The conflict broke out a year ago. Ethiopian and allied forces are fighting against Tigray forces who had long dominated the national government. The Prime Minister has warned against, quote, those who work for the enemy and live amongst them. A new wave of detentions of ethnic Tigrayans is being seen in the capital. Yemeni officials say at least 10 civilians were killed. This after 2 ballistic missiles fired by Houthi rebels struck a religious educational facility in the central province of Marib. The missiles hit a religious school and a mosque. At least 25 civilians were wounded. The Iranian-backed Houthis have attempted for months to take the oil-rich Marib province. Well, the fishing dispute between France and the UK is showing few signs of subsiding. Both sides have accused each other of contravening the post-Brexit trade deal that the UK signed with the European Union. The deal came into effect at the start of this year. France has threatened to bar British boats from some of its ports and tighten checks on boats and trucks carrying British goods. This if more French vessels aren't licensed to fish in UK waters by Tuesday. A trial has begun today for Hong Kong tycoon Jimmy Lai and several other pro-democracy activists over their roles in an unauthorized Tiananmen Square vigil. Last year, police banned the annual vigil for the first time in 3 decades. They cited public health risks from the coronavirus pandemic. Critics believe the ban is part of the crackdown on dissent in Hong Kong following months of anti-government protests in 2019. The UK's rural renewable energy project is working to bring power to communities in Sierra Leone, some of whom have been without regular power for 60 years. The Movamba project, financed by the RREP, is using 32 solar microgrids. All right, that'll do it for your look at national and international news. Take care, Canada.